would like to call upon the chairperson, sir, Professor Laxmi Narayan Rout, to deliver the closing remarks.
Respected Professor Amir Kumar Patnaik, my teacher, respected Professor Misra, Professor Nando, Professor Padi, my friends on the dais, and all the invited delegates, students, media persons. It is always risky to speak at the last, even for 5 minutes. Very difficult to keep the audience attached to you. But as the president or the chairman of the session, I have to speak. I will not repeat what is being told and retold several times, and today also. What I found from all the deliberations of my presenters, they more or less limited themselves to 3 different but very much important aspects of our maritime history. One is migration, the second one is trade, and the third one is regio-cultural aspects. All the talks are based on these 3. So what they have told, that is already known to all of us because of these days' skull-boring deliberations. I am a student of medieval Indian history, and my interest is on medieval studies. I did a little bit of research on maritime history of medieval India, but that goes to the 15th century, 16th century. But here the deliberations are of ancient period. I think if you go to the sources which the presenters use today, they more or less restrict themselves between maybe 6th, 7th century BC to 6th or 7th century CE. That's almost nearly 1,000 years. And all their materials, their conclusions, the study of their materials and their conclusions are restricted to certain sources. So the discussions are premised on mostly classical and secular texts, archaeological findings, sculptural representations, foreign accounts, or a little bit of inscriptions. So these are the main sources. They have referred to a good number of ports of Kalinga and nations, some says Java, Sumatra, Borneo, or whatever names they uttered about Southeast Asia. These were ports of the cities, port cities. I cannot say because these scholars can only certify the nature of their commercial towns, and cities are the port towns. So whatever we see about Kalinga or eastern coast of Indian ports, there is a big difference when we come to the medieval period. I believe in a continuity of our maritime history. I do not believe in the breakup of the maritime history at any point of time because culture evolves. So we have come through a kind of evolution, and therefore we cannot compartmentalize the periods and say that there was nothing happening. Such a situation came when the modern researchers, particularly R.S. Sharma, wrote Urban Decay in India. So he was referring to the early medieval period. We can divide the whole medieval period of Indian history into early medieval and late medieval. So early medieval period says 600 CE to 13th, 14th century. He had built up one theory, urban decay. If you study him, he very categorically and succinctly presents that there was urban decay, and one of the major causes was the absence of seaborne commerce or foreign trade. Because of that, because of the urban decay, there had been absence of our seaborne commerce. I am a person, I do not subscribe to this type of a view or a kind of model which he presented to us, and many of us accepted it. The decline of northern Indian states, a very powerful nationalized state, and fragmentation of the states, and emergence of small states are two different aspects of our history. In one context, Sharma and others say that major states after Harshavardhan broke into pieces throughout the country, whereas in the context of Odisha or Kalinga, from minor kingdoms, we emerged into a major kingdom. So ours is a major kingdom. By the time the Somavanshis came into power, and followed by the Gangavanshis and then the Gajapatis, so we were very powerful in eastern India. Now the question arises, what happened to Kalinga in our own sources, indigenous sources? The indigenous sources were simply sculptural presentations or remnants, and one particular aspect of our sources, that is inscriptions. Odisha was very much famous for having so many inscriptions during that particular period, 1600 to 1200 or 1300. What happened to any kind of reference to this maritime trade, maritime activities, cultural linkages of Odisha with Southeast Asia? We do not have. Odia as a language or a developed literature comes to the 13th, 14th century AD. We didn't have a language like Odia. I do not know whether all the people of Kalinga were talking in Sanskrit. I don't believe in that. Or something else was there. Something was there, definitely. People were interacting. But where we get a reference to such type of activities, and what happened, we don't get anything during that period. Does it mean that our contact with the world, contact with particularly Southeast Asia, came to an end? This only can be answered by the sources of this particular period, 600 to 1300 or 1400, in Southeast Asia only, or in any other part of the world. So if you study, get the materials translated into English and try to incorporate with our own history, then only you will come to establish where we stopped and where the relationship continued. I believe in continuity, even in the absence of sources. Our sources are only sculptural presentations of our early medieval period. Beyond that, we don't have anything. So during this period, whether the old ports, which had shipbuilding capacities, the facilities, the other facilities which are required for propelling our ships across the seas, high seas with high risks. So these things were there or not, we cannot question, because we do not have sources to document for this particular period. And everybody has come to the conclusion that because of the siltation process, because of the change of rivers, because of change in the confluence points, because of the change of commercial cities and towns, so there was decline of ancient Kalingan ports. But how the people were managing their commercial seaborne trade and commerce and the cultural exchanges with Southeast Asia, this remains still a big question mark. But we have to be presumptory in nature in deriving conclusions. We have to only presume that it existed on the basis of our own literature, which flourished in the 13th, 14th century. Please read all the Brata Kathas, all the Osas. Ladies are there, they must be performing some Osas and Bratas, where prominently the Sadhavas figure. Sadhava is a Sanskrit term. Is it a Sanskrit term? It is a Odia term. Everyone referred to. Professor Patnaik referred to Sadhavas, all his presenters refer to Sadhavas. Sadhavas, if it is a merchant community, then what is the maritime community? Maritime community does not necessarily mean the Sadhavas. Or shall we say the Sadhavas were also the experts for propelling the ships across the seas, for seaborne trade and commerce, for enriching our cultural linkages? It is again a question mark. Sometimes we say the coastal communities not belonging to a particular caste, the caste affiliation is not there. So it is a community affiliation. So there were shipbuilders, there were mariners, the pilots who were propelling the ships across the seas, and there were also the traders who were conducting the trade, and there were also monks who were propagating the religion or the culture, whatever you may say. One thing I always try to understand, which tradition of ours we continued to the later period, to the medieval period, or even to the modern period. Ports could not exist. When it came into being, when it passed, when it lost its importance, we do not know. When we come to 15th century, when the Portuguese came in 1498, then came to the eastern coast of India, and Gajapati king granted them permission. They established their commercial town, their commercial establishment in settlement in Pipli first, then Baleshwar, then Tamluk, then Chittagong, Dhaka, all these things you know very well. They commanded the seashore, eastern coast of India, and established a very powerful commercial link with Southeast Asia for more than a century, unless and until they were challenged by the Dutch, the English, and a little later by the French and the Danes. So when we come to this medieval period, what we see, till that time we didn't have any sources. I'm telling of the early medieval period. When they came, suddenly we get a lot of sources. These are the factory records, the correspondences, all the transactions between Odisha or India with mother country, whether you talk of Portuguese Lisbon or English London, whatever you say. So these records are all foreign to us. These were written in different foreign languages also. Then what happened to us? Why it is not very powerfully or clearly documented in our original sources? In Odia sources, we don't have, except these folklore you are talking about, except some imaginative things, some traditions, some myths. So these are not the real sources of historical writing. So these are, in the context of real historical sources, it is something different. So these are mostly, again, presumptory. Now the question arises, where to locate our own history? See, the commercial ports and commercial towns were no more the same ones which were existing thousands of years back. So we have Baleshwar, we have Pipli, we have Hizli, we have Ganjam, we have Jingeli coast, so that is from Chilka Lake up to Godavari. So these are new ports which emerged and having international reputation. If you read the maritime history of 15th, 16th, 17th century, so 16th, 17th, and 18th century, we get enough materials. So far the articles of trade are concerned, more or less it remains the same. More or less it remains the same. If in the ancient period, paddy or rice could be used for balancing the ship, for sailing across the seas. So in the British records, in the factory records, in the travel accounts, we also see from Sri Lanka and other places, elephants were loaded in the ships and coming to the Odisha coast. References are there. It is documented. So they must be balancing that, taking rice, always trade and commerce depended on surplus and deficit. So we are the surplus, we have the surplus of articles, and those are the deficit areas in respect of certain particular articles of trade. So this way the changes were going on, the trade and commerce were going on. And the Europeans, they introduced another element, that is monetization of the economy, rural economy. So that was very much important. They were getting reals of 8, and they were getting some sophisticated articles, luxury articles, and they were exchanging. They particularly the Europeans in the later medieval period, they connected again South Kalinga with Southeast Asia. The lost glory got revived. If there was a break of the cultural exchanges in the early medieval period, if there was no break of cultural exchanges, then you can only imagine, you can only presume that we had a very powerful trade and commercial link, and we were getting enough wealth, and must be the Somavanshi rulers and the Gangavanshi rulers, they will build up such a big empire. They were not getting entire money only by waging wars or through booty. So they must be having, and also there was no expansion of the cultivation in those days. It became a later period that they became very much rich. So the richness must be also from either regional trade, inter-provincial trade, or seaborne trade. So this is to be again proved. And therefore I say the certain things were continuing. This climate. Climate never changed overnight. So the mariners used the traditional technologies to sail their ships across the seas. So these things were continuing. Articles of trade cannot change totally because the production areas and distribution areas, exchange areas, the commercial geography remains almost the same. So what was new to us, which was different from the early traditions of cultural exchange, that has to be located. And I have one suggestion for this, that is, we are using the sources of the period before 6th, 7th century AD. So I would request our scholars in Southeast Asia, they should use their local languages. They should pinpoint their sources which speak about the trade and commerce, the cultural links, the exchange of ideas of that particular period with Kalinga. That part is completely missing in our discourses. I think I am right, maybe I am wrong because I have not read everything. So this part, if can be worked out, I would request Professor Padhi, Upendra Padhi also to focus on locating the sources where Kalinga is reflected. We have located sources where Kalinga is reflected in Southeast Asia, Kalingan culture in Southeast Asia, but the reverse is not taken care of. So I would sincerely request all my friends, those who are doing research, if we didn't have Odia language, I don't think Sanskrit was very powerful in Southeast Asia. Everybody was understanding Sanskrit. They were talking in Sanskrit. They were doing it, all the epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana, they were written in Sanskrit, and they studied Sanskrit. And there are limitations. There are limitations to all regions. There are regional specific situations which we must try to understand. Then only our research will be complete. We can, for modern period, a lot of technologies have come, we are having. So that is different. But to establish a continued history, maritime history of Kalinga with Southeast Asia, with South Asia, with Europe, with Africa, just by taking a few examples, we cannot justify our claim. We cannot justify our own linkages. So rightly pointed out by somebody that we had also something from them. So that is not properly integrated with our history. So if we can do that by way of discussions, by way of cultural exchanges, by way of studying other languages, then it will be very fruitful for us. So we will reach the goal. With these words, I thank Professor Padhi, Professor Nanda, for giving me this opportunity. I have spoken out of my random thoughts, whether you accept it or you reject it, but I have presented. Thank you very much for giving me the patient hearing. I wanted to speak for 10 to 12 minutes. I am completing this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would now like to call upon Dr. Chandi Prasad Nanda, sir, to felicitate the chairperson